start to look at this whole area of economic growth, and you'll see a mind map of all the things. If you want to take a screenshot of that, then please do so right now before I start to zoom in. And there's two different things. There's using this economic growth to compare rates of growth between countries and over time, but also looking at the rates of economic growth and seeing how they compare to living standards. So we're going to do the living standards in another video, so don't worry about that. This video is going to look at a comparison of rates of growth when you're looking at and trying to use the idea of real GDP per head and seeing whether or not that's a good indicator of whether or not living standards have risen between countries. How is one country doing against another country, and then over time. So to start with, you must say that it is a good starting point. It always use real GDP. So it's a good starting point if you're using real GDP. And if you don't understand the difference between nominal or money GDP and real GDP, then go to the first video, the other video, which talks about converting nominal or money into real. But real GDP is simply the physical number of goods and services that you've got in the economy. And also, it's got to be per capita. So the physical number of goods and services per head of population. And so the argument is, if one country has an increase in real GDP per capita greater than another country, then possibly that's a sign that their living standards are going up faster and they're doing better, inverted commas. But when we're comparing between countries, we've got to consider different things. So this part of the mind map shows the different things we've got to consider. The first thing is that different countries are going to have different accounting conventions. They're going to include things in the GDP figures that other countries don't. So as a small point, that's quite important, though, to recognise that the conventions are different. But what I'd be talking about is that, the quality of the data as well as those accounting conventions, how good the quality of that data is. So in some countries, they're going to be collecting a lot of data, good quality data. In other countries, less so. And certainly in some developing countries, you've got problems of street trading going on, and so cash is changing hands, and it doesn't always get included in the data of how well that country's doing. A big one, though, is the problem of what we call unrecorded output. So certain amounts of output are sometimes hidden. They're not recorded. Hidden output, hidden economy is where there has been some economic activity, but it's gone unrecorded because normally people collecting their income don't declare it for tax purposes, and so it doesn't get included. Sometimes that's called the shadow economy. It can be unrecorded simply because you're talking about output that's gone on. Let's say if I build a wall in my house, I pay for the bricks and the cement, but my own time doesn't get included. Whereas if I employed a builder to do it, then there would be a much greater increase in the GDP if the builder did it than if I did it. But at the end of the day, I've still got an increase in the quality of my life because I've got a wall in my garden. So unrecorded output is important between countries, what gets included and what doesn't. And some countries include things that other countries don't. As I say, there's different conventions. So there's certain countries that include an element of drug dealing, illicit drug dealing in their GDP figures, and prostitution and things like that. And so there's a question mark over whether or not those should be included. Some do, some don't, and it can distort the figures between countries. Quality of goods and services is an important one. That, between countries it might be that you've got the same number of goods and services, but the quality is much better in one country. The big ones that you've got to talk about, though, the big sort of ideas, are things like externalities, which is a concept of pollution and the fact that if a firm pollutes the atmosphere in one country and the same firm and in another country it doesn't, that the level of that pollution, the cost of that pollution often doesn't get included in GDP figures, particularly if the government aren't good at fining companies and that sort of thing. So pollution is a big one. I would include in there things like using natural resources up and renewables and non-renewables, etc. So I think a good strong paragraph on whether or not those should be included and are included between countries would be vital, I think, in any essay. So would be the distribution of those goods that are being produced. So if in one country, 5% of the population get those goods, and in another country they're equally distributed, then obviously the quality of life in that second country is going to be a lot better. Some textbooks mention geography, that countries, some countries are cold and they need more fuel, so that will get included, and it's only really in some countries that takes place. Wouldn't include that in most of my essays, but a big one, which there is another video on this, so don't worry if it is a bit tricky. What about the exchange rate? If we're looking at GDP between countries, should we use the exchange rate that's on the markets? And most economists say no, because that gets distorted by market forces. And what we should be using is a concept known as PPP, purchasing power parity. And it simply compares the cost of a typical basket in one country to the same basket in another. So if in the UK, for example, a basket of goods cost £100 and in the US $150, the exchange rate we should use when we're comparing countries is £1 to $1.50. There is a short video on that and why that's the case, which again you can have a look at later. So hopefully between countries you can see there's lots of different things that you should be thinking about. If I had to pick two of the biggest ones, I would be talking about externalities, pollution, congestion, etc., using up scarce resources, and the way in which that income is distributed within the country as really important points to mention. Well, what about if we're using rates of economic growth and saying, well, over time in one particular country, has there been an improvement in living standards? Well, the first thing is, I think here, the quality of goods. The quality will tend to rise over time, but it's rare that you get that accounted for in the GDP figures. So we might say, we've got a 10% increase in the number of telephones, mobile phones, but so we're 10% better off. But actually, the quality, what you can do on your phone now is so much better over time that the quality of life has gone up a lot more than simply 10%. You can go back to the unrecorded output again, that's important. You can go back to externalities again, and that's really important over time. And I would say distribution of income, same as we've said before, is really important to talk about. The only other two that get mentioned in textbooks are defence spending, that over time you might spend more on defence, and does that really make you feel better off? Well, I think you can argue now in some countries it is, because of what's happening in the world at the moment, that we would feel our quality of life is higher if there is defence spending. And are we spending money on consumer goods, i.e. we're enjoying ourselves today, but not saving it and putting it into investment goods? And so therefore, over time, if we put more into investment goods, then we'd get more and more consumer goods in the longer run. And so there's this question about, consumer goods or investment goods. So, that's another thing that people bring up. But for me, I would bring up again externalities, distribution of income, and maybe it's a good one to look at is the quality of goods over time. So hopefully that's given you a good idea of how to use GDP, real GDP per head of population, to compare between countries and over time.